One of the funny stories is pretty much, they had it in a white and blue, and sort of a workboat type finish. They had gotten so fed up with varnish that there was no varnish on the boat except for the main block hanging off the boom. And the story was, although I don't know if it actually ever happened, was that when the varnish got worn out on it, they'd just buy another block. The last time I physically saw it, well, and it was 85 when we saw her at Robin Hood. We had just had our firstborn, and was at Robin Hood Marina, which is near Booth Bay. And it had just been donated to Maine Maritime. And, I can remember looking at it and figuring out, could we put a playpen in the pilot house? And I'm trying to think, it was probably 15 or 20 years ago. I'd done, an internet search, and it appeared to be in a shed at Mystic. It was beyond saving, so to speak. And I think it was in line to have all the lines taken off of it and be documented for posterity. Well, she was an amazing boat. I was a little bit of history. I grew up summering on Cape Cod at a grandmother's house that was on the water and on the harbor. So, was sailing. Some of my first memories are being in a boat with too big of a life jacket on. But everything that I was doing was small boat sailing. And the biggest sailboat I'd been on, at age 8 was my aunt and uncle's 27-footer, I'd say. My grandparents' house, my grandmother's house was, 15 rooms and a lot of bedrooms, but it was, the grandkids were becoming more and more numerous. And originally, the whole family, the 3 generations could stay there, but that had just overgrown, and Cape Cod was just getting too busy for boating. So Kay and Sib, that's my aunt and uncle, they decided to just move their boating up to Booth Bay. So that's when they got Plantina. Since they lived in Ashby, they had it in a yard in Marblehead. And could, one of the things with me getting to go on the boat on trips with them was the reward for going down with them and helping, get the boat ready for the season and doing various things. I'm not sure where they found it, but when they found it, it was being used as a fishing boat. I don't know whether the spars were on it. I assume they were, but they had one kid who was 3-4 years older than me who passed a while ago. But I can remember him telling me that, first time he saw it, it was like, what the hell were you thinking? And it had a big Coca-Cola chest down in the cabin. It sort of took up the whole cabin and where they put the fish. I believe, in fact, the entire interior was brand new from my aunt and uncle. I think when they got the boat, it was, it was a fishing boat. It was not I don't think it was the kind of boat that you would, go on a pleasure cruise in. It was more workboatish. I know they put in the little soapstone stove. In Ashby, there was the next town over, there was a furniture company that made chairs. And at the beginning of the year, he'd always go over there and get all the little ends turned, the nubs taken off chair legs that were turned maple. It was like a bunch of wooden marshmallows. And they were perfectly sized, and they were, put out a lot of heat. And as a result, between that and the pilot house, they were the first boat in and the last boat out. When we brought the boat up from Marblehead, it was probably about this time of year, early May. I do know that when they bought it, they put in a transom seating and some seat lockers, port and starboard. I do remember in the galley where the sink is, right above that is a little portal built into the deck, sort of like a prism thing. And my aunt always had a red geranium underneath that. They were hardcore sailors, and she was a big bird watching person that wrote articles for magazines and that sort of stuff. So they had some press, if I remember correctly, that were, sort of a combination of cruising the Maine coast and what you see for birds. Richard Sibley, and they lived in Ashby, Mass. And her name was Kay Sibley, and they both they were on vacation and were killed in the big 747 crash that was on Tenerife Island, or Tenerife and Canary Islands. It was sold off, and I'm trying to think, 84 was when we moved to Maine from Massachusetts. And I remember being up in Castine in a shop and looking up, and over a doorway was a picture of Plantina. So my guess is that she was sold to somebody in Maine, probably in Castine. I remember coming up once, and it was definitely small craft warnings. Said, let's go sailing. And I was kind of like, are you nuts? We went out, got the sails up, and she didn't ride over the waves. The waves got out of the, she just parted them. She's absolutely fantastic heavy weather boat. I'd say, one of the safer boats I've been on, and that deep full keel with a barn door rudder on the back is, it takes a little bit getting used to, but if you spin the rudder over fully and then open up the throttle, you can make it spin on a dime. Most people don't realize that you can get away with that on a boat with that deep of a hull. It's the seaworthiness, and it's also the volume of the boat down below. For a lot of 36-foot fiberglass boats are, they're built for racing, and they got a fin keel. They barely have standing room. It's really sort of an early motor sailor before motor sailors became all the rage. I remember in Booth Bay Harbor, this would have been early, mid-'60s. But I remember being on the boat and looking around, and it was the tallest mast in the harbor. And, of course, mega yachts weren't around back then. For a 36-foot boat to have the tallest mast in the harbor was kind of and the practicality of having something that motored, but actually, she wouldn't sail in light winds with any speed, but you get the right winds, and she was as good a sailboat, and she pointed high and all that sort of stuff. I remember one thing was that it had hard rat lines going up the starboard side to the first spreader. So the shrouds, it just basically had slats there. And being 11, 12 years old, it was like, just getting on the first slat was like a major accomplishment. And I get all the way up there and feel like I was on top of the world. And of course, the slats were on the starboard side, so I'd do it when we were on a starboard tack. And then I'd see Uncle Sib kind of get a smirk on his face, ready about. And, now all of a sudden I'm on this vertical thing, holding on for dear life. the longest trip that I went on was coming up from Marblehead to Booth Bay, and we went through the Cape Ann Canal, and I remember going off Portsmouth, and we actually went by the Portsmouth lightship. It was back when lightships were still being used, and we motored pretty much all the way. It was dead calm, kind of foggy. I, for some reason, remember Sib saying, he let me be at the wheel as much as I wanted. But as we were passing by Portsmouth, he said, keep an eye out for logs. There's a lot of stuff comes down that river. And the other thing was that I had, I'd always just been doing day sailing in small boats. And so this was the first time I'd really been on a trip where we had to use charts. And then he got out the RDF, the radio direction finder. That whole thing of, getting the beacon that's on top of Cadillac Mountain up in Bar Harbor, and the ones on the Maine coast and New Hampshire coast. They started going to Maine. Well, Kay, my grandfather, grew up with power boats, and he was the Commodore of the Charles River Yacht Club for a few years. And they would go up and down the intercoastal, wintering down in Florida. And I was talking to Captain Black when we first moved up here, who was ancient, who knew my grandfather, who died the year I was born, so I never really knew him. But he said, oh yeah, Bill Durkee, he was the last of the old-time yachtsmen. He kept a log of everything. I remember my grandmother saying, or my mother saying, that his idea of a really good day down on Cape Cod was to have it totally socked in, and then go out in the boat and figure out the currents and so forth and so on, and dead reckon navigation between booths, see how close he could come. But so that was the sort of environment that my aunt and uncle learned about boating in. So Kay was born probably, my mother was born 1915, so I think she would have been born 1917. So she would have, as a teenager, been on my grandfather's boats in the 30s. And we have, my grandfather's generation was pretty amazing. We have movies of them going through New York Harbor, on their boat. They were definitely power boaters. I got it as as a kid, my, there weren't video games or anything. And I went on Cape Cod, and I just sailed constantly. And of all in my generation, I'm like the one that I think probably kept the traditions going. And yeah, I've got my Coast Guard master's license and used to skipper a big schooner, et cetera, et cetera. My cousin, who died, wife, who's out in California now, I haven't written her note to say that Plantina's resurfaced. Yeah, and it was just like, holy cow, it came back to life. But she might have some, and an amusing story. He was in the Coast Guard, and then he ended up going to University of Rhode Island, I think it was. But anyways, he had met Carol, this girl that, he decided to bring her up to Maine and go sailing and introduce mom and dad. And so they go out, and, one of the things with that wicked tall mast is that if something went wrong, you had to go up in the bosun's chair, which I never did. But anyway, so Rob goes up in the bosun's chair. Well, it was kind of rough weather, and they pulled behind an island, and so that the boat wasn't rocking a whole lot. And Rob's going up the chair, and he's like 10 feet from the top when this big, Chris Craft Connie or something of that nature comes around the island full throttle, and these huge waves hit the boat. He's clinging to the mast like a monkey and just screaming at the boat. I know my family, my mother and Aunt Kay were really close, so we probably spent more time on the boat from the cousin standpoint than any of the others. I know the pilot house where the wheel is. Above that is a hatch, and you can sit in the hatch and then steer the boat with your feet. It's perfectly dimensioned for that. But if you're going wing and wing, the problem is if you accidentally dive, there's nowhere to go. You're going to be hurt. And I can remember my oldest sister. She ended up marrying a Japanese guy who, he's actually like, tall, handsome, over 6 foot. And they had come up, and we were all sailing together, and he was steering the boat, and my sister was freaking out because it was like, he was steering the boat like he was steering a car. He didn't have the sailor's sense to know that you absolutely want to make sure you don't dive. And I remember my mother saying she used to, the tides here in Maine are it depends upon where you are, but typically 8 foot. And she says she remembers, having they'd have steamers out on the deck in the cockpit, and then just throw the shells over the side. And she'd remember getting up in the morning and looking down into the water and seeing all the shells on the bottom. It's interesting because in Maine, there still is a reasonable number of wooden boats, unlike Washington State. But it's really the coldness of the water is what keeps them around. Yeah, and then, well, up here in Maine, there's still an active boat building going on, but an awful lot of them are, Hodgdon, which does, big mega yacht sailboats. They end up doing everything with a composite hull that is an awful lot of wood, mixed with modern materials. But it's, just sailing with a wooden hull versus a fiberglass hull. It's just totally different. Boating story, but I remember once being, I was always impressed because Sib would go and row out to the mooring and then bring the boat into the town dock, a little floating dock in Booth Bay, and do that single-handed. And so he had brought the boat in at one time, and we were, putting spring lines on and whatnot, and he's leaning over, and a seagull shits on him. And it was just, being 12 years old and seeing that, and his action was just it was a memorable.